Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jake Wynn, Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, here for another one of our digital history programs on our museum Facebook page, and you will later find this video on YouTube as well. Welcome for another one of these videos. We are excited to have you here watching with us today. We have an excellent guest joining us today, Historian Jill Newmark. Welcome to the museum's Facebook page.
Thanks, Jake, for the invitation, and thank you to all the people that are tuning in. I know some of my friends and family are there, so I'll give them a shout out.
Excellent. And this program that we are doing today is going to be focused on African-American surgeons during the American Civil War. Jill has an exciting project that she's been working on for quite a long time on these surgeons, and she's going to talk us through today their experiences during the Civil War and some of the areas around that. I have some great questions here for Jill to answer, and she has some slides for us, so we're going to see some images as well today. Before we get into that program, do want to just go through kind of our typical introduction program. So most of you are probably, if you've been here before and seen other videos that we have done, chances are you probably know what is coming. But we have been doing these programs since about mid-March, when, due to the coronavirus pandemic, we were, unfortunately, we had to close our doors because of the public health threat. And since then, we have flipped a switch and gone to an online museum. We have done video programs like this. We've done virtual tours. We have added to our blog as well and keep our website kind of up to date with online resources for students, for teachers. This is the way that we have been continuing to fulfill our mission, even though our 3 museums have not been open to the public since, again, mid-March. These videos have been wonderful. Great conversations that we've had, and I'm very excited for today's conversation as well. If you've been enjoying these videos, you can help to support us. You can help support these programs. You can do that by liking this video, going up to the corner, hitting that like button or the love button or react buttons of all different sorts. You can share the video. Sharing the video helps more people to see what we are doing at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, to see these programs, and this program in particular. You can also go to our YouTube channel and subscribe there, and you'll see more videos that we have done over the past, not only past 2.5 months, but you will see videos that we have going back more than a decade over on YouTube. And if you want to take your support for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine to the next level, we are a member-supported institution. You can become a member or a donor, and your money will go directly to support programs like these. And it's really helpful these days because we are not able to be open to the public. And so your donations, your memberships will directly support these programs. So if you're interested in supporting these videos that we've been producing, the blog posts that you see on our website, all of the educational resources that we make available, become a member. You can find a link to that over in the comments. And for those of you who have become members already, thank you so much for supporting our museum and supporting what we do at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. So now let's get into the program, why you are all watching with us today. So again, we are with today historian Jill Newmark. Jill, do you want to tell the audience a bit about yourself, your background, and how you got interested in Civil War medical history?
Well, I am primarily a museum professional. I've worked in the museum field for over 30 years and currently work at the National Library of Medicine in the exhibition program, where I developed an exhibition on African-American Civil War medicine and the physicians and nurses that served during the war. I became interested in this subject because I curated an exhibition called Opening Doors about contemporary African-American academic surgeons. And part of that involved pioneers. And Howard University is a pioneer in African-American education and in their medical school that was started, I think, in 1868. Alexander Augusta, who is one of the surgeons that's featured in the exhibition and in a book that I've just finished, there were 5 medical professors that started the medical department. He was the only African-American among all 5. So I became curious about him and learned that he had served as a surgeon in the Civil War. That's really what set me off on and got the ball rolling. So
excellent. So yeah, so what I know you talked a little bit about this, but you know, what really inspired you to focus on these perspectives of African American medical workers during the Civil War?
well, one of the things in doing that initial exhibition about academic surgeons was one of the things that my co-curator and I wanted to get across was that there were African American physicians in the late 1800s, the 1900s, that it wasn't just this phenomenon that started in the the 20th century. And as I began to explore this, I started to learn about all these fascinating stories and these inspirational stories about these men who had struggled to get a medical education and were not treated as citizens in the United States because of their color, yet they served their country and had so many obstacles, and they really paved the way in America for so many things. They were they were firsts for a lot of things. They were the first African Americans to be medical personnel serving during a war. And so I felt this was a hidden part of history that no one was talking about. And their stories were so important that it just kind of got the ball rolling for me.
Yeah, we at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine we have some parts of our exhibitions about some of these surgeons that we're going to talk about today, as well as other medical workers, African-American medical workers who worked during the Civil War. And I've always found, I know Jill and I have talked about this, and you're going to hear about one of the surgeons that's one of my personal heroes today, Alexander Augusta. These are really inspirational stories. And once you start to dig into their stories, just all of the disadvantages that they had, all of the challenges that were in front of these men and women, mostly going to be talking about the surgeons today, so many of them men today. But I do want to I know you have some slides for us, Jill, so we'll transition into our next question here. Can you tell us about some of these African-American surgeons of the Civil War? Tell us about them.
Sure. I just also want to mention that there were two African-American women that got medical degrees in the 1860s. It was Rebecca Kroll and Rebecca Crumpler. And one of them did actually, I think in 1865, 1866, treat freedmen in Virginia. So, but primarily they were men. So let me, so I'm gonna share my screen. And let me tell you what I wanted to start out, just to give a little bit of a background, is that there were 12,000 surgeons that served in the Union Army. They treated more than 400,000 wounded soldiers. Medical personnel were commissioned military officers, or they were private physicians that were under contract as acting assistant surgeons. Generally, surgeons had a rank of major, and assistant surgeons were captains and lieutenants. Regiments had generally one surgeon and two assistant surgeons. And of the serve, we know of only 14 who were African American. So I'm going to introduce you to all of them briefly. All 14 were freeborn. They received their formal education at universities, many in Canada, because the US wouldn't, a lot of medical schools in the US did not accept African-American students. So they received their formal educations in the US, of the few medical schools in the US that admitted Black students, which included Dartmouth, Yale, Maine Medical College, and Keokuk Medical College in Iowa. Some received their education in Canada and England. Now, Alexander Augusta, I know he's one of your favorites, Jake. He and John Vanzorley de Grasse were the only two that were actually commissioned in the Union Army. The remaining 12 were on contract as acting assistant surgeons. And I'll focus a little bit on giving you a little brief information about some of them. Alexander Augusta was an incredible person. He was the first commissioned African-American medical officer in the US. He was freeborn in Norfolk, Virginia. When he left Virginia at a young age, he went to Philadelphia and he was a barber. His brother lived there and he was a barber. He wanted to go to medical school, but there was no medical school that would accept him. So he went to Canada and got a medical degree at Trinity College of Medicine and practiced medicine there. And in 1863, when the Union began to recruit Black soldiers, he wrote a letter to Abraham Lincoln and then the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, requesting a position. From that, he became the first African-American commissioned officer with the rank of major. His first assignment was at Contraband Camp Hospital, and when he became the surgeon in charge there, he was the first African-American to lead a hospital in the United States. He was eventually appointed a month later as the regimental surgeon for the 7th USCT, United States Colored Troops. And when he was mustered out, he got breveted to as a lieutenant colonel, which was, he was one of 2 of the highest ranking African-Americans to serve in the Union Army and during the Civil War. Just a little brief, Anderson Abbott, Canadian, a friend of Augusta, followed in his footsteps, wrote a letter to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, position, and he received a position as a contract acting assistant surgeon and served at Contraband Hospital. John Rapier Jr., one of my favorites. He was born in Alabama and grew up in Nashville, reared by his grandmother. He traveled a lot, went to Haiti and Jamaica where he went this, and then he decided that he wanted to become a medical doctor, came back to the United States, began his medical education at the University of Michigan, and then went to Keokuk Medical College where he got his degree. He was an avid letter writer and diarist, and those letters and diary entries reveal a lot about his life and his desires and his ambitions. He became a contract assistant surgeon and also served at Contraband Hospital in Washington alongside his school friend, Anderson Abbott. And one other person that no one really ever talks about is Hiram Revels. Most people are more familiar with his brother. I mean, this is Willis Revels, excuse me. They're more familiar with his brother, Hiram, who was a senator and the first African-American to serve in the US Congress. Revels is most known as a preacher in the AME Church, but he was a physician, and he was a recruiter for the 28th Regiment of the USCT in Indianapolis, and became the acting assistant surgeon while they mustered in and he treated the soldiers there until they left for Washington, D.C. Many of the others had similar backgrounds, had a challenging path to becoming doctors and to serve in the Union Army.
Yeah, and that gets to our next question, and this is something we focus on in our exhibitions at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. It's one of the first exhibits you will go into if you visit the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, is about medical education. And as you've already mentioned, Jill, these surgeons that you have focused on kind of have a much more difficult path to becoming a medical doctor than white physicians had. So can you talk about the discrimination that Black doctors faced while trying to attain a medical education in the 19th century?
Yeah, it was really difficult. There are a few, as I mentioned before, a few medical schools that allowed a few African-American students, but it was very difficult. Many struggled to get an education. They generally needed to have like a white politician or a established white physician that wrote letters recommending them. They all had to have a superior education or else they never would have been able to be admitted. It's interesting, just a brief little story. Alpheus Tucker is one of the African-Americans that served. And what's interesting is both he and John Rapier were at the University of Michigan Medical School at the same time. But when John Rapier applied, he had been living in Haiti and Jamaica. And so he said that he was, when it said your last residence or where you're from, it said he was from Jamaica. Well, he was admitted to the school. When Alpheus Tucker arrived on his first day, he was admitted to the school. They put him in the register. When he arrived at his first day of class, he basically was, the white students were in an uproar. They protested against it. the school capitulated to those protestations and they asked Alpheus Tucker to leave. Now, the difference here is that they didn't ask John Rapier to leave. And I think the difference is that he was identified as a foreigner, not a native-born American, African-American. It's interesting, Alpheus Tucker, friends obviously confronted Rapier at some point because he wrote about this and said they came and they were very upset because Tucker had left the school. Rapier eventually left and they both actually ended up at Keokuk Medical College, but it was very difficult and they were not treated very well in most instances.
So once these surgeons are brought into the Union Army, where were these African-American surgeons detailed? What were their roles and responsibilities?
Okay, so of the 14 that we know of, all but one served at Black-only hospitals like Contraband Hospital, which became Freedmen's Hospital, or at recruiting rendezvous and recruiting stations for the USET. These are, you can see here, these are from the National Archives, and they indicate all of those duty stations. There was only one that served out in the field, and I'll mention him in a bit. So what they did is they treated African-American civilians and wounded soldiers from the USCT. They examined recruits at recruiting stations, the African-American men that were joining the USCT. And in some cases, like with Augusta, who was surgeon in charge, he also had administrative duties for running the hospital. He hired staff, he made sure they had supplies, he also tended to patients, so he had a lot of administrative duties. There was only one surgeon, John Fansoli de Grasse, who was he was commissioned as an officer, he was an assistant surgeon, who served in the field with his regiment, which was the 35th Regiment. But he was not treated very well. He was faced a lot of challenges and mistreatment, and he eventually was court-martialed on what I have determined are sort of dubious charges. But the reason that he was the only one is that white surgeons would not serve in the field with alongside black surgeons, and they didn't want to be subordinate to a black officer.
So this next question kind of gets to a little bit what we've already talked about. This is a question that we've gotten from online. So thank you to those of you who have asked questions online via email, or I see some good questions here that we'll get to in just a bit that have already been asked. If you want to ask a question of Jill or myself, feel free to drop a comment in there and we'll try to get to some of those at the end. This is one that was sent to us in advance. Did these black surgeons ever attend to white soldiers or civilians during their service with the Union Army?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And for the most part, as I mentioned, they were assigned to only black patients. But there were some instances, and there could have been more, where if the circumstances dictated, they were called upon. I have to tell you a little bit about this man, Theodore Becker. He wasn't a surgeon anymore, but he was trained as a surgeon in, I believe he was from Suriname, and he came to the United States. When he joined the Union Army, he joined the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which most people know of from the movie Glory. He was a private, but he became a hospital steward. Now, here's a man that couldn't be a doctor. They wouldn't give him a commission as a physician because he was a man of color. But there was an incident occurred where a white officer, a captain in the regiment, got very ill, and there were no surgeons around to attend to him. And Theodore Becker was called upon to treat this man, brought him back to health. Several officers wrote a recommendation that he be promoted to an assistant surgeon, but that never came from fruition because he was a black man. But in this instance, here is a man of color who treated a white officer because he was gravely ill and needed attention, and there was no one else there to treat him.
So on a related note, I have two questions here from the audience that I just want to roll in quick. I think they're pretty quick questions.
Mm-hmm.
First one's from Joe LaFleur. Hi, Joe. And he asks, are there any examples from your research of whites refusing treatment from Black doctors to their own detriment?
So white soldiers not accepting treatment from Black doctors. I have not come across that. I think the circumstances of an African-American doctor and a white soldier are rare, not in the same circles, so to speak. John Van Serly de Grasse, although almost all the officers in that regiment were white, all the soldiers were African-American. So I don't recall, I've not come across that in any of my research.
Okay, and then the other question comes from Lynn Bristol. Hi, Lynn, great supporter of the museum. She asks, during what years of the Civil War did these surgeons enter? Is that coincident with the USCT unit starting to come in 1863?
Yes, yes, definitely. Because Alexander Augusta was the first one. He had his commission in early April. I think John Van Serly de Grasse was later in April, and everyone else falls between 1863 and 1865.
Okay, perfect. So to kind of step back and look at some of these surgeons and some of their politics and belief systems, what inspired these men to join up with the Army in this medical role? And how did they respond to emancipation and some of the amendments in politics after the war?
Yeah, it's how they responded to the politics is because there's not a lot of writing, there's not a lot of letters. There are a few where letters, like John Rapier, because the family wrote lots of letters, there were a lot of letters written. These men came from a life where they were people of color, they were discriminated against, they saw that, they were well educated. Most participated in anti-slavery and abolitionist activities. They fought for education for African Americans, even prior to becoming surgeons. Charles Purvis is a surgeon that served, and his family were staunch abolitionists. It was Robert Purvis and Harriet Fortin. He came from a family tradition of fighting injustice and fighting for equal rights and equal treatment and abolition. So a lot of them came from this background. Many of them came from racially mixed families. So they had exposure to a lot of different things coming in. All of them were staunch abolitionists. And I think in small measure, the act of getting a medical degree was really an act to push things forward. So because they got medical degrees, and some of them were the first African Americans, like Cortlandt Van Rensselaer Creed was the first medical graduate of color from Yale University. So a lot of them pushed the boundaries, and they all acted from a sense of for injustice, fighting for freedom. And to be perfectly honest, they were true patriots because they were fighting injustice and mistreatment in the United States. And they took their action, they took their medical education and used that to advance the cause.
So to flip this over and to look at, we've been kind of looking at things from the perspectives of these men and how they got their education, how they served. But you talk about, about them fighting for justice and in many cases serving in this cause for freedom. How did white Americans feel about African American surgeons putting on these uniforms and becoming, and serving as medical professionals?
Well, that's a complicated question. I mean, there were some that were abolitionists that were behind it. I know Charles Sumner was from Massachusetts, a senator, and he was a staunch abolitionist and helped push things forward, especially with Augusta. But for the most part, if you can imagine in 1863, seeing an African-American man walking down the street in a major's uniform. For example, I'll give you two examples. Alexander Augusta was on a train. He boarded a train in Baltimore. He was accosted on the train, threatened with a club. His epaulets were ripped off his uniform. He was able to get the provost guard's protection after he proved that he was part of the military, went to the provost's office, went back. They found he pointed out who were the perpetrators of this violence against him, brought them back to the provost's office. He went back to the train. On his way there, there were large crowds. He got punched in the nose, got a bloody nose. He got back on the train. The provost guard said he would protect him, but he said, no, I'm on the train now and I'm going. And he wrote about this, and he said which is quoted here, my position as an officer of the United States entitles me to wear the insignia of my office. And if I am either afraid or ashamed to wear them anywhere, I am not fit to hold my commission. So he felt he was a military officer in a military uniform and deserved respect. He also had, so the obviously whites were not in favor of seeing this African-American man in a major's uniform. This did not, this also, let me just say, rolled over to white officers in the Army. This example is when Augusta was appointed the regimental surgeon of the 7th Infantry, mustered in with the 7th at Camp Stanton with 3 other USCT regiments. He's senior medical officer. There were, among them were these 3 white assistant surgeons who wrote a letter to President Lincoln. And they said, we claim to be behind no one in a desire for the elevation and improvement of the colored race in this country, and we are willing to sacrifice much in so grand a cause as our present positions may testify, but we cannot any cause willingly compromise what we consider a proper self-respect, nor do we deem that the interests of either the country or that of the colored race can demand this of us. Such degradation we believe to be involved with our voluntarily continuing in the service as subordinate to a colored officer. Then they went on to say, we therefore most respectfully yet earnestly request that this unexpected, unusual, and most unpleasant relationship in which we have been placed may in some way be terminated. So basically they're saying, we're fighting in this war. We support the elevation of the colored race, but not here. We can't be subordinate. The letter went to Lincoln. Don't know what his response was, but Augusta was then sent to Baltimore to examine recruits. He was taken out of the Camp Stanton. He never served directly with the regiment, though he remained the regimental surgeon. And Joel Morse, that you see here on the left, continued to barrage the government with letters because he wanted, in 1864, he wanted to have Augusta removed as a regimental surgeon because he wasn't there. They did not do that. And I think it was because Joel Morse looking to advance himself and he couldn't do that. So it was difficult.
Mm-hmm. So as we're transitioning, we've talked about the before the war, we've talked about through the war, and I want to get towards the end of the conflict here and heading into Reconstruction. We did get a question from another one of our supporters of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and he's actually done one of these videos as well, is Dr. John Willen. He has a question about Anderson Abbott, and he asks if you can't answer this, that's fine. Anderson Abbott, was he friends with Elizabeth Keckley? And he asks about any connection to the Lincoln assassination there, that he may have been at the theater that night. Do you know about this?
Okay, so here's the story. What's very interesting is that Keckley also wrote a memoir in 1866 or 67, somewhere like that, and talks about the assassination. But Anderson Abbott was friends with Elizabeth Keckley. And the story goes, according to Anderson Abbott, that, let me just step back. One of the things we know is that she was friends with him. When Anderson Abbott applied for a pension, Elizabeth Keckley wrote a deposition, and she referred to their relationship. She said that they were intimate friends. She knew him. She became friends with him in the boarding house that she lived in, that I believe he lived in also when he was sick. She helped nurse him. She knew Augusta because Augusta would go to the boarding house to treat Anderson Abbott. So they were very close friends. On the night of the assassination, according to Anderson Abbott's recollection, a carriage came to the house. A carriage was sent to the house by Mrs. Lincoln, who was looking for Keckley. She wanted Elizabeth Keckley. They were obviously, that was her seamstress, but also her close confidant. Anderson Abbott says they went into the carriage. The carriage went to the White House first, and then they turned. Elizabeth Keckley showed her business card and was let in. According to Abbott, he observed the dying president in one room, and he said the anguished the anguished wife prostrate with grief in the other room, and then he left. And then he says he went back to his boarding house and was awakened the next morning to learn of to learn of Lincoln's death. There are some that have reported that Anderson Abbott was there in the Peterson house when Lincoln died. And I just want to make it, for those that have heard this, there was a medical director of Washington, D.C. was R.O. Abbott. And I think that when they referred to a Dr. Abbott who was writing down the times, like his how many respirations and things, but it was not Anderson Abbott. It was most likely R.O. Abbott, and there's no relation.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that, Jill. Thank you, John Willen, also for asking.
Let me just mention one other thing. In comparing it to Keckley's story, there are a little bit of differences, but according to Anderson Abbott, that's what happened on the night of the assassination.
Excellent. So with that being the kind of transition between wartime and into the post-war, how did these African-American surgeons fare in the years after the Civil War?
It's been out of the majority, I would say, well, let me state this. Half of the 14 African-American surgeons that served at Contraband Hospital in Washington, D.C. Some of them stayed, and Alexander Augustus stayed in Washington, D.C. He set up a private practice. He was a professor in the medical department, as was Charles Purvis. Anderson Abbott went back to Canada. He became the first coroner of Kent County, the first African-American coroner. He also served for a time as a superintendent at Providence Hospital in Chicago, which was a hospital, the first African-American owned and operated hospital in Chicago. Many of these surgeons set up private practices, and they continued providing medical care to their communities. Many of them also continued to fight for injustice, especially Charles Purvis. Charles Purvis has a very long history with Howard University and served on the board there. One interesting thing is that Alpheus Tucker and Charles Purvis and Alexander Augusta, I think it was in 1869, tried to join the Medical Society of the District of Columbia, and were based on their color. They were fighting for acceptance, fighting for equal treatment and equal access. The question somewhat.
Oops, sorry. I thought you might have been breaking up there a little bit. I don't think we heard the last bit of that answer.
What was the last thing you heard then?
Couldn't really tell.
Okay, so let me just say that basically in the in their lives after the Civil War, they continued in private practice, but they also continued to fight for injustice and equal treatment. That Augustus Purvis and Miss Tucker joined the Medical Society of the District of Columbia, and we refused because of their color. Okay.
So we had this question quite a bit from the audience, and this gets towards as we're beginning to wrap up, and then we have some more questions from the audience that are coming in here. What's the future of this research? I know you mentioned a book. We have lots of people asking about the book, asking about any other maybe book recommendations that you might have, but let's hear about your book first.
Yeah, the application process, probably another year or so before it comes out. I was very interested in bringing these stories out, and didn't want to just keep all this information in my head. And so I wanted to create a fairly well researched. There are several publications that are out there that mention them, but there is no single publication that really delves in depth to talk about their early lives and what brought them to a medical education and a desire for medical education, and what them to become surgeons during this. So I did part of it, and I continue to do these types of talks and write articles occasionally, because I think it's a subject about these African-American men had a very existence, broke down a lot of barriers, and they paved the way for changes for African-Americans in society.
Excellent. So another, this is kind of an area of personal interest, and I know that Jill, you've talked at the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum about this, but we recently had Jim Downs, historian Jim Downs, on to talk about his book Sick from Freedom. And going to have some more programs coming up about contrabands, about refugees during the Civil War, and where I'm at in Washington, D.C. is a few blocks away from the site of one of these refugee camps, Camp Barker. Can you talk a little bit about the camp and also its hospital, Contraband Hospital and Freedmen's Hospital?
Sure. Let me show you this. This is a R&S Street in DC, for those that are familiar. It was established. It was established on the grounds of Camp Barker, and when African Americans began to come from the South, Virginia, also from Maryland, the Union Army set up this camp to provide temporary housing, food, and medical care. So part of the medical care was the hospital, and I'll show you, I've earmarked a few spots. You can see these, the hospital wards, and also a smallpox hospital, tented hospital. So they used the barracks that existed, and then they also built tents. They had, you know, like if you can see here, it might be hard to see, they had a stable, a dead house for those that had died, kitchen, dining room, they had some barracks. So the hospital was sent up, and I think in the first year they had over 15,000 contraband that came through. So the hospital was set up there as a means of providing medical care. When the Freedmen's Bureau was set up, the Bureau of Freedmen's, Refugees, Freedmen's, and Abandoned Lands, which we call the Freedmen's Bureau, they set up medical facilities around the country. The Freedmen Contraband Camp eventually changed its name to Freedmen's Hospital. And Freedmen's Hospital, the one in Washington, which is this one, is the only one that survived. And it moved its location because the contraband camp was disbanded. They moved to several locations. They ended up at the land that was part of Howard University, and it was called Freedmen's Hospital. They treated African-American patients there. And you can see kind of the transition here in some of the slides. It remained Freedmen's Hospital. The Union Army, once it moved from the location at Camp Barker to Campbell Army Hospital, and then to the location at Howard University. It was then given over to the Freedmen's Bureau. It was no longer under the Army's umbrella. It was the Freedmen's Bureau. And then in 1961, President Kennedy signed the hospital over, passed a law that would sign the hospital over to Howard University. It was still called Freedmen's Hospital. And then I think it was 1975, Howard University built the hospital and it became Howard University. So it has continued to provide medical care to the Washington, D.C. community since it began as Contraband Hospital.
That's one of the one of the most powerful stories that I think of when I think of Civil War Washington, and that direct correlation between the experience of refugees coming into the city, coming into the nation's capital during this war, and then having this direct connection to today through this very, tangible thing of a hospital, of medical care. And it's this very direct connection that we can draw back to the past because we have this connection through Howard University and Howard University's hospital. It's just such an amazing thing. I love this story in particular because I live about 3 blocks away from where this camp was located, and from where the hospital was, and it's just, it's a powerful connection to the past.
Yeah, what's interesting is if you see in these slides in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of Freedmen's Hospital in 1908. That building still exists, which you can see below it. It's if anybody goes to the campus and is familiar with the campus, there's the Health Sciences Library, and there's sort of like a quad, and the Freedmen's building is still there. I think it still says Freedmen's on it, although it's not a part of the hospital anymore.
So thank you very much, Jill, for the presentation, for the slides. We do have some more questions that we have for you here from over in the comments section. Before we get to those, I do want to thank you all for watching so far today. If you are enjoying the presentation, please consider liking the video. Go share the video. That allows more people. Sorry, I have a very loud vehicle outside. If you are enjoying the programs that we're doing, like and share them on Facebook with friends and family. You can share them. Also, if you want to support these programs, consider becoming a member of the museum. You'll find a link to that in the comments section of the video. So, Jill, we do have a few questions here that I would like to get to, and I think one of them is I think I'll be interesting for your take on this, because we talked a little bit about this with Jim Downs that was last week when we talked with Jim Downs, maybe 2 weeks ago. Time has no meaning anymore in the in shelter in place. So this is another question from Joe. He asks about were the imagined physical differences between races used to keep Black doctors only treating Black patients and not whites? So I'm kind of interpreting that to mean, is in this service of Black doctors, we see in this, throughout the Civil War, that there's these claimed biological differences, and then there's the kind of the political differences there. So what can you say about that?
I don't know if I can say that much about that particular thing. I don't know if biology had anything to do with the assignments that were made. I think that it really had more to do with the fact that the medical surgeons were officers. They had officer ranks. And that was, I think, the main reason that white officers wouldn't serve with them. Besides the fact that there was racial animosity, racial discrimination, the fact that they were officers, as I mentioned before, the white surgeons did not want to serve alongside them, and they didn't want to be subordinate. When Augusta first got to Contraband Hospital, all of the staff, primarily the head nurses and the surgeons, were white. When he was there, a letter was written that said, and I'll paraphrase, now that Augusta is there, we have to reassign all the white doctors because a white physician can't be subordinate to a Black man. This is the reason why Augusta got assistant surgeons, William P. Powell Jr. and Anderson Abbott as his assistants, and then the white head nurses were replaced with African American. That biology had much to do with that, but it did have to do with the medical treatment and care that African American soldiers had. And a number of years ago at the Society of Civil War Historians, I put together a panel about whether Black soldiers would have gotten better medical care if there were more African American doctors. Because when the African American surgeons were there, they could use their positions to at least advocate for better conditions and better services. And they had a better understanding of the situation. They had a better understanding of the discrimination and the racism that African Americans faced. Mm-hmm. So that's the best.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Thank you very much for that. This one comes from Marcia, who messaged us the question, and I know she's been watching many of our videos. So thank you, Marcia, for this. She asks, did these Black surgeons that you've been talking about, that you've been researching, did they receive pensions for their service during the war?
That's a really interesting question. Alexander Augusta died in 1890, I think. I can't remember the exact date. As far as I know, he did not apply for as a widow. Unfortunately, the National Archives has misplaced that file. So I have never been able to look at it. Anderson Abbott, I think, attempted to apply for a pension, as did William P. Powell Jr. And one of the interesting things is that William P. Powell Jr. applied for a pension, and he spent 24 years trying to get one, and never did. The laws changed. Originally, you had to have a war-related injury. Then old age became pensionable. But I believe that there was definitely discrimination, and that African Americans that applied for pensions, especially the surgeons, did not fare as well as white surgeons. One of the things that the Pension Commission said is, well, you weren't a commissioned officer, you were on contract, but that didn't always hold true with white surgeons. So it was a difficult path, and I think William P. Powell fought for his right to have a pension, but he died before, he spent 24 years doing it and never received a pension.
Yeah, and that's a topic that we have talked about in a couple of our other videos about pensions and pension system. I do want to give a shout out for coming up next Friday. We have a presentation planned with Damian Shields of the Irish and the American Civil War blog, and he has written pretty extensively on the pension system and the problems with the pension system for immigrants and those living abroad whose loved ones next of kin served in the Civil War and were receiving pensions. So if you want to learn more about pensions, we do have some more programs coming up on that, not looking at it from the African American surgeon or African American soldiers perspective, but looking at it from immigrants and from the immigration perspective as well. So I think.
And let me just say.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let me just say one more thing about the pensions. There is clear evidence that pension commissioners and reviewers of pensions did not take stock in an African American's deposition, and in some instances were directed to not pay that attention. They didn't feel that they were credible witnesses. So that had a lot to do with why African Americans did not always get the pensions that they applied for.
Thank you. Thanks for adding in that perspective. So it looks like we are out of questions here. So we're going to start to close things up. Jill, I want to thank you so much for taking the time and coming on live with us today.
Well, thank you, Jake. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I want to thank everybody that participated and sent in such great questions.
And we look forward to having Jill back at the museum, either in DC or in Frederick at some point in the future, whenever that may be. But I want to thank, as Jill did, I want to thank everyone for watching, for tuning in with us, for supporting these videos. If you did enjoy the video, you can still help us by liking and sharing the video, and it'll allow more people to see it, even after we are offline here. You can also watch these videos over on YouTube as well. So subscribe to the YouTube channel for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and you can support us by becoming a member as well, donating to the museum. It helps to support these kinds of programs. Thank you all so much for tuning in with us today, and we hope you have a wonderful and safe, especially safe, weekend out there. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.